Liam Hayes was an exceptional mail carrier. In a small town where everyone knew each other's faces, Liam was famous not only for his punctuality, but also for his friendly and approachable nature. Every morning, he cycled along his familiar route, his bulging mail bag swaying on his shoulder, and his smile was the first thing many people saw to start their day. Liam always made it a point to greet everyone he delivered mail to. Mr. Peter, who lived on the corner of 12th Street, would always wave at him while watering his garden. "Good morning, Mr. Peter. Your roses look beautiful today." Liam never failed to notice the little details that made others feel valued. At house number 22, Mrs. Wilson, a retired teacher, often spent a few minutes chatting with Liam whenever she received her newspaper. "Liam, don't you think the weather is lovely today? I just baked some cookies. Would you like to try one?" Liam always politely declined, but what he truly noticed was how her legs seemed shakier than usual. The next day, he brought her a walking cane he had seen on sale. "Just a small gift, Mrs. Wilson, to make walking a bit easier," he said with a warm smile. However, not everyone reciprocated Liam's enthusiasm. At the house at the end of the street, Mrs. Anna Cole would quickly grab her newspaper and retreat inside. Liam always greeted her with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Cole." But she would only give him a slight nod, avoiding eye contact with a sorrowful expression on her face. Still, Liam didn't give up. He thought to himself, maybe one day, she'll want to talk. Liam wasn't just a mail carrier. He was a keen observer. He noticed the smallest changes: a garden no longer tended, a car parked in the same spot for too long, or even a window light that stayed on all night. To Liam, his job wasn't just about delivering mail, it was about connecting with people. He believed that sometimes all it took was a smile or a simple greeting to make a difference in someone's day. But it was Liam's keen sense of care and attention that led him to uncover a heartbreaking story hidden behind the closed doors of Mrs. Anna Cole, sparking a journey that would change both her life and his forever. Mrs. Anna Cole was an elderly woman who lived alone in a small, quiet house at the end of the street where Liam Hayes delivered mail. Every morning, Liam would cycle to her home, knock on the door, and greet Mrs. Anna as she came out to collect her newspaper. But Mrs. Anna wasn't like the other people on his route. She never smiled, nor did she respond to his friendly greetings. Instead, she always looked down, muttered a few short words, and hurriedly closed the door, as if afraid someone might see her. At first, Liam thought Mrs. Anna was simply an introvert who didn't enjoy social interactions. But over time, he began to notice unusual things. The first time he paid attention was when he saw a small bruise on her wrist as she reached out to take the newspaper. Liam thought to himself, maybe she fell or bumped into something. But then more bruises appeared, on her arms, her cheek, and once, even on her forehead. The old injuries seemed to barely heal before new ones took their place. Not only that, Mrs. Anna's face grew increasingly gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes and a panicked look whenever she saw Liam. Her frail appearance became so alarming that Liam couldn't help but notice. Yet every time he asked, she would shake her head, force a weak smile, and quickly change the subject. "It's nothing, I'm just a little tired," she would say, her voice so faint it seemed like she didn't want him to hear. Liam felt worried, but Mrs. Anna always kept everything to herself, leaving him unsure of what to do. He could only continue observing, paying close attention to even the smallest changes. In subsequent deliveries, Liam noticed that her movements had also changed. Her steps were slower, sometimes unsteady. Once, he even caught a fleeting glimpse of her grimacing, as if trying to hide a wave of pain. Mrs. Anna never said anything, but Liam knew something was deeply wrong, and it troubled him. What should I do, he wondered. Deep down, Liam understood that if he didn't act soon, something worse might happen to Mrs. Anna. But how could he help her when she was so determined to remain silent? These questions lingered in Liam's mind, creating a sense of worry he simply couldn't ignore. For over a month, every morning, Liam Hayes had delivered the newspaper to Mrs. Anna Cole. This familiar routine was more than just a job. It was his way of connecting with the people in the neighborhood. But with each encounter with Mrs. Anna, his heart grew heavier. Mrs. Anna was no longer the same as when he first met her. If she had once seemed merely reserved, now her appearance radiated an unsettling weariness. Her cheekbones were more hollow, her skin paler, and her sunken eyes carried a look of fear every time they met Liam's gaze. The bruises on her body became increasingly evident, one day on her wrist, another time on her cheek, and one morning she appeared with a large bruise on her forehead, which she tried to hide beneath a thin scarf. Liam noticed these changes but hesitated. He told himself, "She doesn't say anything, so what right do I have to ask? What if it's just her private matter?" These thoughts made him reluctant to intervene. Every morning, standing at her door, Liam tried to start a conversation. He talked about the weather, the neighborhood, anything he could think of, but Mrs. Anna always cut him off with a quick nod or a brief reply before disappearing behind the door. Her silence not only left Liam puzzled, but also made his worry deepen. I can't stand by and watch her like this for much longer, Liam thought. But the idea of respecting her privacy held him back. Mrs. Anna neither asked for help nor shared her troubles. Was it right for him to cross that boundary? Day by day, Liam continued to watch closely, observing every little detail. The bruises, her frail posture, and the way her eyes avoided his seemed like silent cries for help that he couldn't ignore. "I'll wait a little longer," Liam told himself, but deep down he knew Mrs. Anna needed help and he wouldn't be able to stand idly by forever. In the days that followed, Liam's worry slowly turned into determination. He began to wait for the right moment to act, a moment that would come sooner than he expected. That morning, Liam Hayes cycled to the last house on his route, Mrs. Anna Cole's home. As usual, he knocked on the door, holding the newspaper in hand, waiting for her to come out. The door creaked open slowly, and Mrs. Anna appeared, but the sight before Liam left him stunned. Mrs. Anna looked more frail than ever. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken with dark circles, and a fresh bruise stood out on her cheek. Her hands trembled as she reached out to take the newspaper from Liam. Her usual evasive gaze now seemed to be pleading for help, but she said nothing. "Good morning, Mrs. Anna," Liam said, trying to keep his voice calm, though worry churned inside him. "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" Mrs. Anna shook her head weakly, her lips quivering as if she wanted to say something. But before she could respond, she suddenly staggered. Liam lunged forward to catch her, but she collapsed into his arms, unconscious. Liam's heart raced. He gently laid her down on the porch steps and checked if she was still breathing. Feeling her faint breaths, he immediately pulled out his phone to call for help. "We need an ambulance right away. An elderly woman has just collapsed, and her condition is very serious." As he waited for the ambulance, Liam kept his eyes on Mrs. Anna. He carefully draped his jacket over her to keep her warm, his gaze fixed on the bruises on her hands and face. "I've let this go on for too long," he berated himself. When the ambulance arrived, Liam accompanied Mrs. Anna to the hospital. Throughout the journey, he kept reassuring her, even though she remained unconscious. "You'll be okay, Mrs. Anna. We'll take care of you." At the hospital, Liam anxiously waited as the doctors examined Mrs. Anna. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew this wasn't just a simple fainting spell. The bruises and the fear she had been hiding all this time were signs of a deeper, more painful story. And now, he understood that he had to take action to help Mrs. Anna escape this situation, no matter what it took. At the hospital, Liam Hayes sat outside the emergency room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Anna, frail, bruised, her trembling hands. What has she endured in that house? The question echoed relentlessly in his mind. When the doctors completed their initial examination, one of them stepped out and informed him, "The patient is awake." However, her condition is very fragile. Severe exhaustion, two fractured ribs, and multiple old injuries that haven't fully healed. This doesn't seem like an ordinary accident. Hearing this, Liam felt his heart sink. He knew he had to speak with Mrs. Anna, even though it wouldn't be easy. When he entered the room, he found her lying on the bed, her face still pale, and her gaze avoiding his as usual. Liam pulled a chair close and spoke gently, yet firmly. "Mrs. Anna, I know we haven't talked much before, but today I really want to help you. I've seen how much you've been suffering, and I can't just stand by and watch anymore. If something is happening, please tell me." Mrs. Anna turned her face away, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. "No, there's nothing, Liam. I'm just unwell," she said, her voice so faint it was almost a whisper. But Liam didn't give up. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm here to help you. What I see on your face and body isn't just coincidence. If someone is hurting you, please let me help." Hearing these words, Mrs. Anna fell silent for a long time. Her shoulders began to tremble, and finally, tears streamed down her cheeks. I've endured this for too long," she choked out. Mrs. Anna's husband, Mr. Lucas, had once been a successful man, but in recent years, his life had spiraled into financial ruin. Mounting debts, unstable jobs, and a deep sense of failure consumed him. Instead of facing these challenges and finding solutions, Mr. Lucas chose to blame those around him, particularly Mrs. Anna, the wife who had stood by him for many years. At first, Mrs. Anna understood the pressure Mr. Lucas was under. She chose to remain silent when he lost his temper, hoping he would eventually regain his balance. But Mr. Lucas didn't stop at harsh words. Gradually, his outbursts escalated into acts of violence. At first, it was just a shove or a slap in a fit of anger. But over time, Mr. Lucas began to find relief in physically abusing his wife as a way to vent his frustrations. Despite her pain, Mrs. Anna endured it all. She believed it was the only way to keep the family from falling apart. But the abuse didn't stop. It became more brutal. Mr. Lucas started torturing her in more vicious ways whenever she resisted or tried to protect herself. Neighbors occasionally heard the arguments, but no one truly intervened. And Mrs. Anna, with her evasive gaze and forced smiles, kept everything hidden. She didn't want anyone to know the pain she was enduring. That morning, Mrs. Anna was resting in her hospital room, her body still aching from the severe injuries she had endured. She thought she had escaped Mr. Lucas, at least for the time being. But little did she know that his rage would lead to a series of violent and threatening actions. Mr. Lucas stormed into the hospital with bloodshot eyes and heavy, determined steps. He flung the door to Mrs. Anna's room open so forcefully that it slammed against the wall. Startled, Mrs. Anna sat upright in panic as he marched toward her, pointing an accusing finger in her face. "You think this is how you escape me? You think anyone will believe you? Everything that happens in my house is my business," Mr. Lucas shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. Liam, who happened to be standing nearby, heard the commotion and immediately ran toward the room. As he entered, he saw Mr. Lucas advancing aggressively toward Mrs. Anna's bed. Without hesitation, Liam stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Stop this right now, Mr. Lucas. This is a hospital. You can't do this here." But Mr. Lucas ignored the warning. He slammed his hand on the table near the hospital bed, sending objects crashing to the floor. "Who do you think you are meddling in my business? "Get out of my way before I make you regret it," he bellowed, his face contorted with rage. Not stopping there, Mr. Lucas began to destroy everything in sight. He hurled a chair to the side, flipping over the small bedside table. He even yanked the curtain off the window, letting it fall to the floor. Every destructive act seemed to cut deeper into Mrs. Anna's growing fear. Mrs. Anna curled up on the bed, tears streaming down her face. But this time, Liam didn't back down. He stood his ground between Mr. Lucas and her, maintaining his composure even as a nurse had already called for security. Realizing he couldn't get closer to Mrs. Anna, Mr. Lucas changed tactics. He pulled out his phone, put it on speaker, and shouted, "You'll regret this, Anna. I'll make sure you come back to me, I swear." His voice was full of threats, an attempt to drown Mrs. Anna in fear once again. Liam immediately called the police, and within minutes, the sound of sirens blared outside the hospital. Mr. Lucas, aware he had gone too far, refused to stop. When the officers entered the room, he continued yelling, attempting to justify his actions as teaching his wife a lesson. The police demanded that Mr. Lucas stop immediately, but he resisted and refused to cooperate. They were forced to restrain him with handcuffs and escort him out of the hospital as the staff and patients looked on. Mrs. Anna, though shaken, was finally safe, at least for now. Liam stood by her side, silently vowing to ensure she would never face Mr. Lucas's wrath again. This was not the end of her story, but perhaps it was the beginning of a new chapter. As the police restrained and escorted Mr. Lucas out of the hospital, Liam knew this was only the first step in the journey to seek justice for Mrs. Anna. He wasn't content to simply stand by. With determination and a strong sense of responsibility, Liam took immediate action. Liam reached out to the authorities and presented a detailed account of everything he had witnessed. He provided a thorough statement, describing the times he had seen Mrs. Anna with bruises and the morning she collapsed at her doorstep. The doctors at the hospital also contributed, sharing medical records that clearly showed Mrs. Anna's injuries were not accidents, but the result of prolonged abuse. A swift investigation was launched. When the police searched the home of Mr. Lucas and Mrs. Anna, they uncovered substantial evidence of domestic violence. Broken items, signs of frequent conflicts, and testimonies from neighbors who had heard arguments and the sound of things being smashed. During questioning, Mr. Lucas initially denied all accusations, claiming he was simply disciplining his wife and insisting it was a family matter. However, faced with irrefutable evidence and Mrs. Anna's testimony, he was forced into silence. The court quickly reached a verdict. Mr. Lucas was found guilty of domestic abuse and sentenced to prison, along with additional penalties. Authorities also issued a restraining order to ensure he could not approach Mrs. Anna after his release. For Mrs. Anna, this was not just the punishment of her abuser, but also her liberation. For the first time in years, she felt safe, free from the constant threats of fear and violence. Liam, the devoted mail carrier, was not just a witness, but a companion who helped Mrs. Anna find her voice and reclaim her strength. With his support, as well as that of the community and the authorities, Mrs. Anna began to rebuild her life, step by step, emerging from the shadows and moving toward the light. After the dark days, Mrs. Anna finally broke free from Mr. Lucas's grip. With the support of Liam and the community, she was relocated to a safe house provided by an organization dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse. At her new shelter, Mrs. Anna began her journey of recovery, both physically and emotionally. The early days were not easy. She was still haunted by the echoes of Mr. Lucas's shouting and his violent outbursts. Occasionally, in her dreams, she found herself trapped in the old house, unable to escape. But each time she woke up, She reminded herself that she was free now, that her life had changed for the better. Liam visited her frequently. He brought small gifts such as a book, a few flowers, or simply spent time chatting with her. His presence gave her a sense of safety, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Liam's sincere encouragement gave her strength, helping her believe that she deserved a better life. The community where she had once lived didn't turn their backs on her. Neighbors who had previously remained silent now understood the truth of her story. They organized donations of clothes, supplies, and even financial aid to help Mrs. Anna start over. One neighbor even helped her find a light part-time job at a small flower shop. Day by day, Mrs. Anna began to heal. The bruises on her body faded, and the wounds in her soul started to mend. She learned to love herself again, attending counseling sessions and forming friendships with other women who had experienced similar situations. Together, they shared their stories and encouraged one another to move forward. One morning, when Liam came to visit, Mrs. Anna smiled, a true smile, for the first time in years. "Thank you, Liam," she said, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Liam simply smiled and shook his head. "It's all because you were brave. I just did what anyone should do." Mrs. Anna no longer feared looking toward the future. She knew that while her journey to recovery was far from over, she had found the light at the end of the tunnel. She had regained her freedom and, most importantly, her faith in herself. After rescuing Mrs. Anna and helping her escape from an abusive life, Liam Hayes didn't stop at being just an observer. He saw this as his mission, not just delivering mail, but connecting with the community, recognizing those in need, and taking timely action to help. Throughout Mrs. Anna's recovery, Liam remained by her side. He helped her piece together the fragments of a life that once seemed irreparably broken. At first, Mrs. Anna hesitated to accept help, but Liam's patience gradually broke down her walls. He accompanied her to regular medical checkups, helped her find a new home, and rallied charitable organizations to provide essential supplies. Liam also connected Mrs. Anna with a support group for survivors of domestic abuse. Here, she found empathy and solidarity among others who shared similar experiences. The shared stories and therapy sessions helped her gradually regain her confidence. One day, Liam found Mrs. Anna a part-time job at a small flower shop in the neighborhood. "You've always loved taking care of plants, and this will help you rediscover your joy," he said. Indeed, the new job gave her a renewed sense of purpose, helping her overcome the feelings of loneliness and fear. The story of Liam's courage and dedication didn't stop there. His actions quickly spread through the community, and people began to see him as a silent hero. During a neighborhood ceremony, the local government presented Liam with an award to honor his contributions. "Liam isn't just our mailman. He's someone who brings hope and restores our faith in humanity," the mayor said during the ceremony. Despite being honored, Liam remained humble, emphasizing that he was simply doing what was right. "I'm just doing my job, but I believe that sometimes a little care can change someone's life," he shared. Following the events with Mrs. Anna, Liam earned the trust of the entire neighborhood more than ever before. He frequently received requests or stories from the people on his route. Mr. Peter on the corner asked him to keep an eye on things while he was away, and Mrs. Wilson asked him to check if the flyers she distributed were being noticed. Liam's keen eye and quick thinking allowed him to spot small but important details. Once, he noticed that the mailbox at Mrs. Gray's house hadn't been cleared for days. Deciding to check, he discovered that she had fallen inside her home and was unable to call for help. Thanks to Liam's timely action, Mrs. Gray was taken to the hospital and recovered. Beyond his mail route, Liam also became actively involved in community events, organizing donation drives for those in need, supporting local children with their studies, or simply lending an ear to those who needed someone to talk to. On the day of Mrs. Anna's flower shop grand opening, she invited Liam and expressed her deepest gratitude. "You didn't just save my life, you gave me a new one. I'll never forget that," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Liam smiled and responded with his usual humility. "You did all of this. I just helped you see the strength you already had." Liam's story didn't end with helping one individual. It became a source of inspiration for the entire community, reminding everyone that with a little care and attention, anyone could create a significant impact on someone else's life. Liam continued his work, but now, he wasn't just a mailman. He was a bearer of hope, healing, and connection. Liam's story underscores the importance of compassion and attentiveness in our daily lives. Sometimes, by simply paying attention to small details, like someone's evasive gaze or changes in their routine, we can recognize signs of distress and intervene in time. Kindness is not just a personal virtue, but a thread that connects people, helping to build stronger and more resilient communities. Liam's actions also teach us about courage and responsibility. He did not hesitate to stand up for Mrs. Anna, despite the risk of facing Mr. Lucas's wrath or dealing with personal challenges. This serves as a reminder that in difficult situations, doing the right thing can make a profound difference, not just for others, but also for ourselves, knowing that we've acted with integrity. Moreover, the story affirms that no one deserves to endure abuse or live in fear. Mrs. Anna, though a victim, found the strength to rise and reclaim her life with the support of the community and her own determination. It's a powerful lesson in resilience and the ability to overcome adversity, even when all hope seems lost. Community support played a pivotal role in this story. Through the collective effort to help Mrs. Anna, the narrative highlights that we cannot do everything alone. Unity and shared compassion can provide strength and solutions to problems that might otherwise seem insurmountable. It's also a reminder that we all share a responsibility to care for one another, creating a better environment for everyone. Finally, Liam's story encourages us not only to observe and act for others, but also to inspire kindness in those around us. His actions didn't just save one person, they sparked a sense of responsibility and decency in the entire community. This is a clear testament to the fact that kindness doesn't just spread, it creates a ripple effect, inspiring others to join in doing what's right.